Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we talk about today's news, trends, and views from an admittedly conservative perspective. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and tonight we're joined by Gene Hoffman of Cal Guns Foundation, and we're going to be dispelling some of the myths about the psychology of guns and how they scare the bejeebers out of people versus the reality that they actually protect folks. So, Gene, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, and thanks for having me.
So tell me, how did you become a gun extremist in the first place, or what got you involved in guns?
Well, you know, look, the issue is that as a person was born in the South, firearms were as normal as fire extinguishers or bowling balls. You know, these are things you had in your closet. You know, some dads golfed, some dads shot skeet, hunted. So when I moved to California in the late 90s, you know, watching California really, truly change what the Second Amendment meant in front of my eyes kind of drove me nuts. And I have a weird background history of enjoying hacking government a little bit. I was responsible partially for helping cryptography become exportable from the United States, and so developed a kind of strange set of skills about how to take these sorts of civil rights issues and these sorts of free thought issues and help people advance them against the government.
And so you didn't approve of California's revisionist approach to laws, history, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, California's an odd duck. The politics here have been extremely strange. I mean, you know, people kind of hold Ronald Reagan as a stalwart of gun rights, but in fact, he banned open carry here in California as a response to the Black Panthers. So a lot of the really bad gun ideas have generally started here in California. Things like so-called assault weapons bans, magazine capacity restrictions, universal background checks. Those are all California-centric things.
Right. And so the question is, have they all of those things helped much? Or does it just make people feel better?
Well, I think it's mostly make people feel better. It's a little more complex than that. I will say that California seems to have a slightly lower rate of what are called multiple victim public shootings. So it's possible that there is some value to at least the way we report mental health here in California.
Right.
The 5150 system and the Welfare Institutions Code requires people who look like they're a danger to self or others to actually be reported. That makes it so they can't easily buy a firearm. But as much as that may help, when you actually go look at crime, when you actually go look at, you know, what are the likelihood that you're going to be shot by somebody else, well, it turns out that Texas, with none of the restrictions we're talking about, in very similar population size, very similar urban areas, similar border issues, their gun homicide rate is much lower than California's.
And what do you attribute that to?
Well, I think some of it actually may be that gun ownership in California is relatively lower than gun ownership in Texas. You know, famously, John Watts purported that concealed carry licensing or open carrying actually decreases violent crime and increases property crimes. You know, surprise, surprise, crooks aren't maybe as dumb as they look. If there's a risk that if they pull off a mugging or a robbery that they might get shot, even out in public, they're less likely to do that.
Imagine.
Imagine. And of course, here in California, some counties, you know, it's relatively shall issue. The Cal Guns Foundation turned Sacramento shall issue, for example. But, you know, here in the Bay Area, the counties range from you better have a really good reason to there's no way you're going to get a carry license.
In Alameda County, I think, is one of those, unless you're politically connected, you're less likely to be armed. Where are some of the easier places in the Bay Area to get, or is that just not happening?
I mean, Monterey County is about as close as you get to the Bay Area, and that's still not that great.
Right.
You know, this is one of the major issues. You know, the Supreme Court has said that we have a right to keep and bear arms, and that right is individual, and that right, you know, kind of historically applies to the 14th Amendment, which is all about taking the freedmen and arming them, frankly. And most states actually honor the right to bear arms. So in most states, you go to your sheriff or your judge, and you know you fill out and pay $25 and show that you've done an NRA training course or something, and you can carry a firearm.
Right.
There are a few states left, about 6, where you could get a license, but it's extremely rare. So California, one of those, Hawaii, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts,
right.
Until very, very recently, Illinois. But the federal courts there forced Illinois to go to a shall issue environment.
Okay. And so, but we're in California nowhere near shall issue at this point, is the guess?
Well, we're not there yet, but we're waiting on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals as we speak. So the way these things work is that you have various circuit courts around the United States. And, you know, the Seventh Circuit, which is Illinois, has said, look, if the right to bear arms means what the Supreme Court says it means, then you really actually have the right to carry a gun in public. subject to training and some, and I use these words loosely, common sense regulation. Of course, my version of common sense is very different than what I think those who don't like guns would say it is.
Yes.
But, you know, we're waiting right now for a decision from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. That case was argued late last December. So it's likely to see something here in the next few months.
But it is the Ninth Circuit that you're talking about.
Yes, but the Ninth Circuit's surprising in some ways. I mean, as much as people lament the Ninth Circuit for being relatively insane, you know, there are a lot of folks from Alaska and Oregon and other states where, you know, gun ownership, carrying a firearm is far more normal. So in fact, you know, we had the first state to incorporate the right to arms before the Chicago case was here in the Ninth Circuit. So there are some judges on the Ninth Circuit who understand this and understand the Supreme Court wasn't kidding when it said that individuals had the right to keep and bear arms.
Okay, excellent. And so what I intuited from one of your previous statements is you're not necessarily against things like making sure crazy people don't have weapons. So you're not totally anti-gun law, period.
That's right.
But don't infringe on everyone's rights for the sake of a few.
Yeah, look, there's also this kind of core issue hiding underneath the entire gun control, gun rights argument. There are supply controls and there are people controls.
Right.
Right. People controls, it's relatively easy to get all gun rights supporters, or at least the normal ones, to agree that, look, if you've been judged a danger to yourself or others, you probably shouldn't have your gun rights for at least a period.
Right.
Right. If you've committed a felony, you know, there's a long history. People talk about, well, you know, felons get their rights back. Before 1880, felons were just killed. So it doesn't really matter whether you got your rights back or not.
You can do anything you want now, you're dead.
That's right, you're dead. So, you know, those sorts of bars and using those effectively, well, you know, look, we've got an experiment in that. That's California. We still have a high gun homicide rate.
Right.
You know, that's about the best we can do. But there's this fallacy that somehow if we restrict the types of firearms or the number of firearms, that somehow that would cut into gun crime. And it seems to be a very large fallacy because, look, there are 300 million firearms in just the United States.
Right.
Firearms can be printed at home on a 3D printer, done in your garage on a CNC mill. I mean, these are not advanced technology in some sense. You know, the modern firearm dates from 1860. Right. So from that perspective, we've been making them far before the Industrial Revolution in some senses.
Right. And so looking at all of those and the fallacies as you've described them, and I would agree with, how are those laws working? I know you said there's still a large number of homicides and that kind of thing, but for example, reducing capacity to 10 rounds in a magazine versus other places that you can do more. Has it been helpful?
No, it's not helpful because when you think about firearms, there's kind of offensive use versus defensive use.
Right.
And it's pretty clear that the government and society has an interest in stopping offensive use of firearms, right? But the issue is, you know, if you're a good law-abiding citizen, you're the one likely to actually comply with the 10-round limit.
Right.
So you're the one who's not going to be out there perpetrating a crime. You're going to be the victim.
Right.
So all of a sudden, you know, somebody comes up to you, pulls a knife, pulls a firearm, and you've only got 10 rounds with which to defend yourself. Well, NYPD has a hit rate of about 20%.
I was going to bring that up, yeah.
And so you're talking about maybe 2 rounds hitting a person. And this goes to another fallacy. Everybody's watched the movies. You know, 1 round in your chest knocks you down, right?
That's if you hit them. And I'm curious about the New York rate, just because I've heard that they also hit a lot of other civilians. Does that count as a hit?
Well, you know, look, we can look at the, what was it, the most recent shooting on the streets down in downtown where, you know, they hit more civilians than they did the actual perpetrator.
Right.
But no, the problem is that it takes quite a few pistol rounds to actually incapacitate someone. I mean, these, again, are the kind of fallacies. It's the reason you don't see armies carry pistols except in a backup capacity.
Right.
Because it's very hard, actually, to kill somebody quickly.
Yeah.
You know, the flip side of this, though, is it also assumes that you're attacking or you're being attacked by only one person.
Right.
So the moment there's 2 or 3 folks and you can only hit 2 out of 10 rounds, I mean, I guess you're now down to a club instead of a firearm very, very quickly.
And so, and then in California, when people were able to open carry, they couldn't keep their weapon actually loaded either, so which meant that they had to give the criminal a fighting chance by getting everything together, loading it, and then trying to hit them with less time.
That's right. I mean, and look, this goes to the whole social value of firearms. I mean, one of the real values of firearms is this deterrent effect it has from, you know, lowly street thug all the way up to how our various levels of government work and how, you know, when society breaks down, you're a little bit more worried about looting and robbing folks, right?
Right.
Anytime we make it very hard for the law-abiding to be extremely effective with their firearms, we give the crooks that much more on that balance. And anytime you do that, they respond with, you know, the correct incentives.
And so I'm just looking at, for example, last weekend in Chicago, or 4th of July in Chicago, where they have some of the strictest gun control laws in the country.
Right.
And still was 17 people and 17 people dead and 70 people injured in gunplay over the weekend.
Exactly. Well, I mean, look, when you actually look at the stats, there's not a lot of debate here. So there's about 12,000 gun homicides a year. And, you know, yes,
out
this
of
is
300 million guns.
300 million guns, 300 million people. I mean, let's think about what numbers we're talking about. But when you start breaking into, okay, so who shoots and who gets shot?
Right.
Well, 80 to 90% of the shooters are already felons or otherwise prohibited from owning firearms. So they've already broken the law once before. They're broken the law again by possessing a firearm. And then who gets shot is actually a very interesting question as well. Something like 60 to 70% of who gets shot have long, violent criminal past. So most of the gun violence in America is gangsters and drug warriors shooting each other.
And so you're saying that's Darwin, let him work it out, or?
No, but I think it's a reflection on what drug policy's done. I mean, you know, look, if you're in any other business, if you run a food truck, right, and somebody tries to steal from your food truck, you can call the cops.
Right.
But if you run a crack dealership, there is nothing you can do but shoot it out to have that territory, to get your money back. And so, look, incentives matter. You know, a great example of the stats here, everybody kind of says that we have a high gun homicide rate here in the United States.
Right.
Well, Mexico, where guns are basically banned, to certainly the law-abiding, has something like 6 times the rate of gun homicides we have here. But of course, the drug war fuels that.
Well, and our own Department of Justice selling them the firearms at automatic and with high-capacity rounds available.
Absolutely.
None of that contributes at all.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it wouldn't be that a police chief was shot by one of those rifles over the weekend.
Right, exactly. And so, well, they're absolutely right when they say that they're being armed by Americans too.
Quite. Well, and they are being armed by Americans.
Yes.
I mean, the American dollar that's driving this drug trade and, you know, the most valuable drug trade in, frankly, the world, right? Well, of course you're going to have people with firearms. And look, this goes to all the supply limitations where people think that if we're going to stop the supply of firearms, it'll stop crime.
Right.
If the supply limitations would work, we would be stopping all the cocaine and marijuana importation as well.
Right.
But the fact that they can import people, guns, money, well, it's pretty easy to smuggle the guns in the middle of all the money and all the drugs.
Right, yeah. And as you said, it's part of the uniform.
Correct.
Because you can't call the police.
That's right.
So we're looking at all of these different issues, and I've seen even on a local level, there are a lot of politicians, especially in the Bay Area, who feel like we need to do something that makes us feel good. And so we have too many 12 and 13-year-old kids with illegal firearms. We better make it harder for people to buy bullets. We better make it harder for law-abiding citizens to own bullets and make them, they've talked about bullet registries and doing background checks and all of those kinds of things. But they missed the point of the 12 to 13-year-olds and the felons aren't going to Big Five to buy these things in the first place.
Well, that's also the correct, and the bigger problem is that it's the law-abiding who are the ones who buy a large amount of ammunition. It's the law-abiding who care whether they can hit what they're shooting at.
Right.
Right. You know, when you're a criminal, it really only takes 6 rounds to go hold up your local liquor store.
Yeah, because you don't normally have to fire all of them.
That's right. But the thing is, in the defensive situation, when you're dealing with someone who doesn't want you to be around or wants to rape you if you're a female, you know, look, you want to have as many rounds as possible. You want to know that you know how to use your firearm in a panic situation, right? That requires going to the range. It requires going to the range often, and that is in society's best interest. I mean, we as a society have no interest in having law-abiding gun owners not be a good shot.
And so, for example, what about Joe Biden's strategy of you got to go fire off a couple of rounds in the air and ignore the fact that gravity will draw the...
Yeah, I mean, look, what Joe Biden recommended by saying go shoot your shotgun in the air is exceedingly negligent. I mean, we're talking about doing something that may harm a completely innocent bystander.
Right.
Every 4th of July, we hear about people who shoot their firearms up into the air. You know, at least 2 kids were killed over the 4th of July by idiots doing that. So when the vice president is out there telling you to do something which, by the way, generally will get put in jail, it's also illegal to discharge your firearm, except actually in self-defense. You know? The idea being that you, if you need to, should actually just shoot the person who's attacking you with threat of bodily harm.
Right. And so, you know, I don't know if you feel like getting into it, but the AR-15 versus shotgun debate. I mean, people are afraid of AR-15s because they look scary. They look like the military. And so in California, we've done things like try to take off safety features to make them look less scary.
That's right. Well, look, the AR-15 is actually probably the perfect culmination of a self-defense rifle. It has become, in one case it's called the patrol rifle, and it's in every single CHP car in California. So if people ask, is this common, does it have defensive uses? Look, we don't arm the CHP to go on the offense and kill a lot of people, right? It is very easy to handle. It's very lightweight. It is, in many ways, much easier to handle for women than a shotgun is.
Because of less kick.
Less recoil, total less weight, often not as long. I mean, when you start thinking about, a defensive situation, a suburban or urban place, the length of what you're carrying, door frames, those things matter.
Right.
The AR-15 is much shorter, it's much easier to use, and it turns out it's a little less powerful. The AR-15 is actually less likely to penetrate your drywall and the next wall and the next wall in a lethal way as a shotgun actually can.
Right.
And those really matter when you're thinking about self-defense in an apartment building, for example.
Or a hunting deer rifle type of a situation with a higher caliber.
The funny part about the AR-15 is it's not necessarily something one uses with deer. It's really not actually that powerful. It's kind of one of those weird things about the human animal. We aren't actually the most armored animal out there. When you think about the similar kind of predators, AR-15s are often useful with things like mountain lions. But, if you went on a pig hunt, it's not necessarily enough rifle to take down a pig.
Right. Right. And so what are some of the other major fallacies you see out there as irrational fear of firearms kinds of
Exactly.
scenarios?
Well, I mean, people approach the firearms issue and they only count the harm. So they look at it and they say, look, there's 12,000 homicides, there's 30 or 40,000 suicides, and there's some negligible amount of accidents, and that's all bad.
Right.
But it doesn't take into consideration the social science, which is well proven by kind of both sides of the issue, that more than 2,000 times a day, firearms are used defensively without a shot ever being fired.
Meaning?
Meaning that people show their firearm to someone trying to break into their car, their home, all sorts of scenarios. And of course, what usually happens is the crook gets scared, runs away. Your homeowner doesn't even call the police because no crime finally actually happened.
Right.
They also, especially here in California, don't want to have contact as a gun owner with a policeman because the policeman starts asking questions about, did you illegally carry your loaded firearm outside of your house, which is completely unlawful in California? Did you brandish it? Did you point it at him? I mean, we see people who, in any other state, would be applauded by the district attorney for using a firearm to defuse a situation, be prosecuted for brandishing.
Right.
Right. These are not the kinds of things you want. So what happens is you have to survey these things kind of very differently. People don't necessarily talk about how many times they used a gun defensively because, again, it's very rare you actually have to shoot.
Right.
But, when you start looking at the numbers, both sides agree that something like 1.2 million people per year use a firearm defensively. And so it's such dwarfing even all the harms, even if you count suicides. Because in some ways, suicides, they matter. It's sad that people do, commit suicide, but the thing is, people would substitute suicides with jumping off bridges or, the garage. Like, there are other ways. It's just that firearms are effective.
Right. And so we're not banning bridges for those kinds of suicides.
Look, we spend a lot of time on gun control, but we refuse to put the suicide net on the Golden Gate Bridge.
Right. 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 And so over the last several years, probably heavily since 2009, around January-ish, there have been a lot more firearms purchased in the United States whenever people can, and ammo to match. How has the gun crime rate gone with all those extra lunatics with firearms and associated lead? It's
continued to fall to historic lows. So the gun crime rate kind of peaked in the early and mid-'80s, right? And since then it has been cut more than in half and continues to fall. So both the gun homicide rate and the total violent crime rate continue to fall through the floor and across the board.
What about the multiple mass shootings like the Columbines, the Connecticut kinds of scenarios?
Well, it looks like to us that those things happen a lot, in the same way that I'm sure right now it looks like air crashes happen a lot. Right? But in the air crash example, it had been since 2001, right after 9/11 actually, that we actually lost an aircraft in the United States. So, when you start looking at those and you actually kind of look over time, we don't have more of those. We've had all of them. In fact, we've had them back into the early 1900s in Germany.
Right.
And in fact, people don't know this, but the worst school shooting ever was actually not a school shooting. It was a pipe bomb in the 1930s, and it took out like 60 children. So this idea of multiple victim, events and incidences are actually sadly common, have nothing to do with the number of firearms. I mean, the firearms supply in America has continued to just increase. Now, what doesn't get talked about is, for example, the multiple victim public shooting 2 days before Newtown that wasn't. So in Clackamas, Oregon, a person stole an AR from someone and came in with his ski mask on and started shooting. He shot 2 people, and a young man who had a licensed concealed firearm pulled it out. He didn't shoot. I mean, this goes against all the myths. The reason he didn't shoot, he was worried about the bystanders behind the guy with the AR.
He actually checked behind the target.
Checked behind the target, which is one of the 4 rules of gun safety. But the guy who was on a suicide mission saw this, ran into the hallway, and committed suicide. So, you know, it wasn't a multiple victim public shooting because only 2 people died because someone with a firearm was there to end it.
Right. And so I know it's controversial, but it's in the news right now. Any ideas about the Trayvon Martin scenario?
Well, the Trayvon Martin scenario, you know, everybody confuses this with what's called stand your ground laws.
Right.
And, you know, the stand your ground law, believe it or not, California has the what's called Castle Doctrine version of it. If someone is in your home and they aren't invited, they are basically assumed to be a felon, effectively. And once they're assumed to be a felon, you can shoot them. In the Trayvon Martin situation, Zimmerman didn't claim the stand your ground basis because it's not clear that he didn't pick a fight, right? But if a fight escalates to the point where you're worried about getting killed, right? You, no matter who the aggressor was, in almost every state in the union, you have the right to defend yourself, up to and including with lethal force. So, you know, when you look at bloodied, bruised, broken nose, back of his head with scratches, and a single gunshot wound, you can see who was losing that fight and why self-defense mattered.
Right. And so we only have a few minutes left, but any legislation that we should be paying attention to now on the gun rights versus gun grabbers spectrum?
Well, look, you know, what's going on in Sacramento is extreme. The Newtown, Connecticut situation brought every anti-gunner out with every bad idea they've ever had. As we've progressed, we've seen a lot of those things fall to the wayside, so some of the ammunition taxes, some of the things like mandatory insurance for gun ownership that are clearly unconstitutional have again kind of died. There are 2 or 3 things left that people should keep an eye on. One is a ban on and a forced registration of every single semi-automatic rifle. So your .22, any semi-automatic rifle, you won't be able to buy another one in California. Now, again, we think this is wildly unconstitutional, but that's what's coming down the pike. Also, ammo registration we talked about. There's an attempt to try to make it so that you have to have a card to buy ammo. It would ban the interstate transfer of ammo effectively. We think those are the sorts of things that just can't be there. I mean, we couldn't see this. Would you be required to, before you pray, get a registration check? Right. We don't think so.
Right. So if people are interested in learning a little bit more about CalGuns, where can they look for more information?
Online at calgunsfoundation.org and also in the web forum calguns.net.
Okay.
Both places excellent resources for gun owners and California gun owners particularly.
And do you have newsletters that keep them aware?
We do. You can sign up there. You can follow us on Twitter. We're CalGunsFDN there, or on Facebook, certainly.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for your time this evening, Gene. I know you're all over the place, and so we appreciate you educating us on the myths versus realities of gun ownership. If you'll hold on for just a moment, we need to take a quick break for some information from the Conservative Forum.
The Conservative Forum of Silicon Valley began with 20 conservatives meeting at a restaurant in November of 2003. Our mission is to promote the principles of American liberty through education. By 2012, we had grown to over 600 paid members. Our monthly meetings feature well-known and prestigious conservative speakers addressing issues that are critical to our country's very survival. This includes speakers like Victor Davis Hanson, Andrew Breitbart, David Horowitz, and many others. In addition to our monthly meetings, we sponsor a conservative local cable access TV show, The Right Side, covering today's topics. Our Constitution discussion group not only teaches the Constitution, but started our annual essay contest that awards 2 $1,000 scholarships to local high school seniors. We are a virtual clearinghouse for grassroots organizations by providing them with table space at no charge in our exhibit area. There are typically a dozen groups represented. If you are like-minded, join us at our next meeting and become motivated and empowered. Liberty, made in America.
And welcome back to The Right Side. That was a word from the Conservative Forum. They underwrite the show, but and we appreciate that tremendously. Don't stop that. But we also like to point out that the Conservative Forum is best known for their speaker series. Once a month, typically on the first Tuesday of the month, except for in July and in August, the speaker series hosts a number of people, some of them nationally known, such as our August speakers, which are Steve Forbes, as well as Elizabeth Ames, and they're co-authors of the Freedom Manifesto. Yes, if you were wondering, yes, that's Steve Forbes. In September, we have Elizabeth Nixon, author of Ecofascism. And in October, Robert Spencer, the director of jihadwatch.com. And in December, Michael Ramirez, senior editor and editorial cartoonist, will be there. And I believe there will also be an interview by Lou Dobbs. So if you are interested in plugging into some of those events, you can do that at 432 Steerlin Road here in Mountain View, about 3 minutes away from the studio. But if you'd like to read the information for yourself, you can also find it at theconservativeforum.com. And in closing this evening, Gene presented a lot of very helpful information, dispelled a lot of the myths of the feel-good political stuff that we tend to do here in California versus the reality that gun crimes, especially violent gun crimes, are down, that safety, it can be a result of gun ownership, and that things such as the ammo bans, etc., don't really make us that much safer in the course of our daily lives. If you do have an opportunity, please do check out Cal Guns Foundation and learn more for yourself about responsible gun ownership and the things that may be at risk for you if you're not paying attention. Again, we'd like to thank you this evening for joining us on The Right Side. I've been your host, Chris Pareja, and I look forward to seeing you either on the show or in person sometime soon. Thanks again for joining us.